Hi there, and welcome to this day in history for January 7th. January 7th is the 7th day of the year in the Gregorian calendar. Most years there would be 358 days remaining until the end of the year, but this being a leap year, there are 359 days remaining in 2020. Today's word is palimony, another portmanteau or blended word. It's a noun meaning financial support or other compensation given by one member of an unmarried couple to another after separation. It's a blend of pal and alimony. From Latin, alimonia, which means sustenance, from alire, which means to nourish, ultimately from the Indo-European root al, to grow or nourish, which also gave us adolescent, adult, old, alumnus, altitude, enhance, coalesce, prolific, outre, and hauteur. Earliest documented use of the word palimony is 1977. January 7th, I want to say happy birthday to my granddaughter Jacinda. Happy birthday, Jay. Hope you have an awesome year. And moving on, before we get started, I want to mention that links to my research are included in the show notes. And with that, we're going to start with the year 1536, when Catherine of Aragon died at the age of 50. You may remember that we mentioned her recently when her husband Henry VIII wanted a divorce for entirely selfish reasons. In 1610, Galileo Galilei made his first observation of the four Galilean moons, Ganymede, Callisto, Io, and Europa, although he was not able to distinguish the last two until the following day. In 1782, the first American commercial bank, the Bank of North America, opened. On January 7 of 1785, two explorers crossed the English Channel in a balloon. Frenchman Jean-Pierre Blanchard and American John Jeffries traveled from Dover, England to Calais, France in a gas balloon, becoming the first to cross the English Channel by air. In 1789, George Washington won the first U.S. presidential election. Voters cast ballots to choose state electors, and only white men who owned property were allowed to vote. As expected, George Washington won the election and was sworn into office on April 30th of 1789. On January 7th of 1891, a woman named Zora Neale Hurston was born. She was a novelist and folklorist. She was born in Alabama, and although at the time of her death in 1960 she had published more books than any other black woman in America, she was unable to capture a mainstream audience in her lifetime. Today she's seen as one of the most important black writers in American history. She portrayed struggles in the early 20th century American South and published research on hoodoo. The most popular of her four novels is Their Eyes Were Watching God, published in 1937. She also wrote more than 50 short stories, plays, and essays. In 1892, a massive coal mine explosion left nearly 100 dead in Krebs, Oklahoma. This disaster, the worst mining catastrophe in Oklahoma's history, was mainly due to the mine owner's emphasis on profits over safety. In 2002, the victims of the Krebs mining disaster were honored by a memorial built at the site of the old mine. In 1894, William Kennedy Dixon received a patent for motion picture film. On January 7th of 1901, the confessed Colorado cannibal Alfred Packer was released from prison on parole after serving 18 years. On January 7 of 1927, the Harlem Globetrotters played their first game. They traveled 48 miles west from Chicago to play the first game in Hinckley, Illinois. They won 101 out of 117 games that first season and introduced many Midwestern audiences to a game they had not seen played before. As owner, coach, manager, publicist, and sometimes even substitute player, Mr. Saperstein worked overtime to book games for his team, and by 1936 they'd played more than 1,000 games and appeared in Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, Michigan, Montana, Washington, North and South Dakota, but they didn't actually play a game in Harlem until the late 1960s. January 7 of 1946, A case of split personality and puzzling Chicago murders. The killer had written a message in lipstick on a victim's wall: "For heaven's sake, catch me before I kill more. I cannot control myself." It took authorities a while to track down a suspect, a 17-year-old named William Hearns, who had in his possession items from the crimes, but who insisted he knew nothing about it. They also found a letter with these items written to William from someone named George M. Eventually, they determined that this George M. was William Hearns' alter ego. Slowly, investigators pieced together the pathology that drove Hearns. Apparently, he could only find a certain kind of gratification through burglaries, and then he later discovered that committing a murder during the burglaries added to the thrill. While doubtful that he was a true schizophrenic, prosecutors decided not to risk losing an insanity defense and agreed not to seek the death penalty against Hearns, and he pleaded guilty to 3 counts of murder and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. He died in prison in 2012. This is the birthday of American singer-songwriter Kenny Loggins, who was born in 1948 and turns 72 today. On January 7 of 1950, Rudolph the Red-nosed Reindeer was the #1 song on the U.S. pop charts. You know Dasher and Dancer and Prancer and Vixen because of an 1823 poem, A Visit from St. Nicholas, also known as "'Twas the Night Before Christmas." But your knowledge of Rudolph, the most famous reindeer of all, comes courtesy of a department store copywriter named Robert L. May, May's songwriter brother-in-law who set his words to music, and the singing cowboy who made a household name of May's creation. On January 7th of 1953, President Truman announced that the U.S. had developed a hydrogen bomb. In his final State of the Union address before Congress, President Harry S. Truman told the world that the United States had developed a hydrogen bomb. On this day in 1955, contralto Marian Anderson became the first person of color to perform at the Metropolitan Opera. On this day in 1959, the United States recognized the new Cuban government of Fidel Castro. Despite fears that Castro, whose rebel army helped to overthrow Batista, might have communist leanings, the U.S. government thought at the time that it could work with the new regime and protect American interests in Cuba. Unfortunately, that didn't work out so well. Relations between Cuba and the United States almost immediately deteriorated. U.S. officials realized that Castro, who was sworn in as the premier of Cuba in February of 1959, wielded the real power in Cuba. His policies concerning the nationalization of American-owned properties and closer economic and political relations with communist countries convinced U.S. officials that Castro's regime needed to be removed. Less than 2 years later, the United States severed diplomatic relations and in April of 1961 unleashed a disastrous and ineffectual attack by Cuban exile forces against the Castro government, what we know as the Bay of Pigs invasion. Now, we talked about Pol Pot the other day, and here's a follow-up story on him. On January 7 of 1979, Pol Pot was overthrown as Vietnamese troops seized the Cambodian capital of Phnom Penh, toppling the brutal regime of Pol Pot and his Khmer Rouge. The Khmer Rouge, organized by Pol Pot in the Cambodian jungle in the 1960s, advocated a radical communist revolution that would wipe out Western influences in Cambodia and set up a solely agrarian society. In 1970, aided by North Vietnamese and Viet Cong troops, Khmer Rouge guerrillas began a large-scale insurgency against Cambodian government forces, soon gaining control of nearly a third of the country. By 1973, secret U.S. bombings of Cambodian territory controlled by the Vietnamese communists forced the Vietnamese out of the country, creating a power vacuum that was soon filled by Pol Pot's rapidly growing Khmer Rouge movement. In April of 1975, the Khmer Rouge captured Phnom Penh, the Cambodian capital, overthrew the pro-U.S. regime, and established a new government, the Kampuchean People's Republic. As the new ruler of Cambodia, Pol Pot set about transforming the country into his vision of an agrarian utopia. Cities were evacuated, factories and schools were closed, and currency and private property were abolished. Anyone believed to be an intellectual, such as someone who spoke a foreign language, was immediately killed. Skilled workers were also killed, in addition to anyone caught in possession of eyeglasses, a wristwatch, or any other modern technology. In forced marches punctuated with atrocities from the Khmer Rouge, the millions who failed to escape Cambodia were herded into rural collective farms. Between 1975 and 1978, an estimated 2 million Cambodians died by execution, forced labor, and famine. In 1978, Vietnamese troops invaded Cambodia, capturing Phnom Penh in early 1979. A moderate communist government was established, and Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge retreated back into the jungle. In 1985, Pol Pot officially retired but remained the effective head of the Khmer Rouge, which continued its guerrilla actions against the government in Phnom Penh. In 1997, however, he was put on trial by the organization after an internal power struggle ousted him from his leadership position. Sentenced to life imprisonment by a people's tribunal, which critics derided as a show trial, Pol Pot later declared in an interview, "My conscience is clear." Much of the international community hoped that his captors would extradite him to stand trial for his crimes against humanity, but he died of apparently natural causes while under house arrest in 1998. On this day in 1999, the Senate trial and the impeachment of U.S. President Bill Clinton began. And that's all I've got for you today. As always, links to my research are included in the show notes. Thank you so much for watching. Give it a like if you enjoyed this video. Consider subscribing if you haven't already, and feel free to share if you found this video interesting or informative. While you're on the interwebs, check out my other channel, 8 Susquehanna. There's a link in the show notes to that. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time. There's a little birdie on my front porch. Alrighty, back to work. Okie dokie, Smokey. Okay, that's all one long sentence. All right. That's a lot of words. I don't know how to say that. Well, figure it out in editing. Some things just can't be done. Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? She's not a man. See, this is what happens when we're not scripted. This is why I don't do live shows.